So, for many people today in the 21st century, when we say California wine, this can bring to mind imagery of rolling hills of vineyards, graciously appointed Mediterranean style wineries, and fragrant oak barrels. And we often think of the famed wineries up in your community in Sonoma and Napa. We think of the Central Coast of Temecula, the Central Valley. And in all of these wine regions, this industry drives tourism across the state. As you well know, a visit to a winery in beautiful Sonoma, in Los Olivos, Temecula, Livermore, or even in my hometown, Fairfield, California, this visit is an immersive and sensory experience. For those of you who are locals, I know that this is something you truly understand and appreciate. From the smell of wine fermenting in oak barrels to the buttery finish of a California Chardonnay to the complex aroma of a truly good red wine, wine is something that draws on all of our senses. But even though wine occupies such an important cultural and economic place in our contemporary society, historians actually know relatively little about the pre-World War II history of the industry, and we know even less about the diverse groups who built it, particularly when we consider the history of wine relative to other agricultural industries like citrus, which is something that my peers have studied extensively. And until recently, pioneer mythologies have predominated in histories of the pre-World War II industry. I'm talking about historical figures that you all may recognize here, people like Sonoma's own Mariano Vallejo or Agustin Haraszti, who's sometimes referred to as the father of modern viticulture. Figures like these often dominate historical memory. Other histories locate the origins of the wine industry later in the 19th century, closer to the turn of the 20th century, with the arrival of Italian-American wine growers and the founding of organizations such as the Italian Swiss Colony and the California Wine Association. Although these individuals and groups are certainly part of the history of California wine, they offer a rather incomplete portrait of the past, and they really do contribute to the mythologies that obscure the realities surrounding the beginnings of California wine. So what I do in the Grapes of Conquest is I address the gaps between the popular imagination and the history of viticulture in California. In the book, I locate the origins of wine growing within the frameworks of conquest and settler colonialism that defined the region over the course of the long 19th century. The history that I recount in the Grapes of Conquest challenges and complicates what we know about the genesis of California wine. Now, the book is an interethnic study of race and labor in rural California. And in the book, I examine how diverse groups, including California natives, Mexican Californios, as well as Chinese, German, and Euro-American migrants came together to build this industry. I argue that the early wine industry is a really important missing piece of California history. It's one that reshapes our understanding of how conquest played out, of how citizenship, race, and notions of whiteness were constructed in California, and how agribusiness developed, ultimately laying the groundwork on which citrus could flourish. And that piece on citrus is really important. I argue that, the wine industry laid important groundwork that made it easier for citrus farmers to build their industry. I also demonstrate how California's wine industry grew out of changing land use practice and race making, and I highlight the immigrant, working class, and multiracial workers who built this storied wine industry. These diverse populations challenge the industry's contemporary identity as the sole purview of Italian Americans and elite populations. I also identify the industry's origins not in Sonoma and Napa, but rather in Southern California, where Franciscan missionaries oversaw California natives in planting the region's first vineyards and in producing California's first wines. Later, Mexican Californios would expand these mission vineyards in their vast ranches across Alta California. And I'll just pause here and note that these are on my right here. These are Chinese laborers at Leland Stanford's Vina Ranch up in Northern California. This was in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, and he had a really large vineyard up there. This is from the late 19th century. And then on my left here, we have Mexican vineyard workers at his Warm Springs Vineyard, which is near present-day Fremont, very close to the university campus. So these are just two groups whose labor made it possible for this wine industry to develop in the 19th century. What I'd like to do now is turn to the roots of the wine industry in Spanish and Mexican California, some of which I cover in chapters 1 and 2 of the book. And more specifically, I'd like to focus on the experiences of California natives. Although they are rarely associated with California wine, their labor proved absolutely indispensable in establishing the roots of viticulture in our state. Now, viticulture and winemaking operated as part of the arsenal of cultural and social tools that the Franciscan missionaries used for conquest and conversion, as well as a rather overlooked area where California natives resisted Spanish authority. Franciscans used viticulture to Hispanicize and to convert California natives, and wine growing emerged directly from the mission's broader foundation in European agriculture. Finally, the Spanish also used viticulture and wine to help reinforce racial and social hierarchies that limited the rights of California natives. So first, why was establishing viticulture and winemaking in Alta California so important? Well, it was so supremely important because the finished agricultural product, sacramental wine, was integral to the process of conversion. Without it, the Franciscans could not say the Mass and demonstrate transubstantiation to the Indians and convert them. For example, in his correspondence throughout the 1770s, Junípero Serra frequently lamented the challenges he faced in obtaining a regular supply of religious provisions and sacramental wine for the Mass, which, he claimed, inhibited the missionaries' evangelization efforts. I spent a lot of time reading his correspondence, all the letters that he sent to his superiors in central Mexico. And a continuing theme there was the shortage of religious items. This included things such as candles, missal stands, and portraits of saints. He repeatedly complained to his colleagues in Mexico City for their failure to send religious supplies to the missions in Alta California. He wrote, quote, "I do not see a single article directly concerned with the spiritual side of the missions, not even a blank register for inscribing baptism, or a little statue, a painting, or a holy picture," unquote. So for Serra and the Franciscans, sacramental wine was one of these fundamental religious goods, which they needed for the Mass. And without being able to perform the Mass and demonstrate transubstantiation, they maintained they could not convert Indians to Christianity. But even more than church furnishings, securing wine was more challenging as it needed to be replenished regularly. It wasn't like a missal stand. Once it was procured, it was done. No, they needed to replace the wine after it was consumed. During these early years, the missionaries transported wine directly with other supplies from Baja California or central Mexico. Well into the 1770s, shipments of essential items to the northern missions from Baja California included barrels of wine to be distributed among the missions. In one letter, Serra expressed relief that 3 kegs of wine had arrived safely, giving him, quote, "the satisfaction of being able to say the Mass," unquote. So without the wine, his civilizing mission was for naught, and therein lay the urgency to establish vineyards and to ferment wines so that they could have a regular and reliable supply of sacramental wines. The second goal or purpose of planting vineyards was that the neophytes' labor in the vineyards, as well as in mission gardens, stockyards, and grain fields, was part of their education and training towards becoming domesticated farmers. Indians performed most of the vineyard work, particularly the hard field labor. Initially, this included clearing land for new vineyards, planting vines, and digging irrigation systems. Later, this work would expand to include the grape crush and fermentation process. And because the Franciscans required native laborers to plant, harvest, crush, and ferment the wine, they forced the Indians to become active participants in making the products used for their own conquest and conversion. Now, despite the importance of wine to the Spanish mission project, mission records suggest that it took roughly 10 years to establish reliably productive vineyards. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, if it was so important, why didn't they rush this or prioritize it? But the reality was that people in the missions were hungry, and feeding people, securing a regular supply of food by planting agricultural food products and staving off hunger took precedence over planting vineyards for sacramental wine. So it took a bit to get vineyards planted and wine produced. But we do know that the region's first vintage likely came from mission wineries after the Franciscans planted vineyards at San Juan Capistrano in 1779, or possibly at San Gabriel in the early 1780s. We do know that by 1808, 12 missions had vineyards and wineries on site, though the quantity of wine produced was likely small in the 18th century. And here I just have an image of Mission Santa Barbara, and the vineyard was located right next to it. In addition to the on-site vineyard, Mission Santa Barbara and many of the other missions had properties that were outlying a little bit further away from the central missions. These were called estancias. Many of these estancias also had vineyards. So in addition to colonizing California natives, the Spanish also introduced foreign plants that disrupted local environments and altered natural landscapes. This included the mission grape, which was planted across Alta California. Later generations of vineyardists, particularly Americans in the mid-19th century, would routinely identify the mission or the California grape as being native to the state. In actuality, this grape was not indigenous to the region, but was imported to Alta California via the mission vineyards of Baja California. We do know that in other Spanish colonies across the Americas, this grape varietal was known as the criolla grapes, suggesting that the plant was of European origins and had changed through adaptation to the conditions and soils in the New World. And very, very recently, I just learned of this, of course, after my book was published. Researchers over at UC Davis have done some DNA work on the mission grapes, and they've actually identified that it might be a hybrid of a native grape. So I need to learn more about that. It's absolutely fascinating. What's interesting about mission viticulture and winemaking was that it was generally standardized across the mission system. So wine that was produced at Mission Sonoma would have been used the same process as what was used, say, down at San Gabriel. And the reason for this is that the Franciscans relied on an agricultural treatise imported from Spain. This was called Agricultura General, and this guided them in the cultivation of grapes and other crops. The book included instructions on how to select the best soil, how to lay out a vineyard, how to plant vine cuttings or shoots, and how to harvest the grapes. It also detailed instructions on crushing and fermenting the grapes, as well as the best practice for storing wine properly for fermentation. And this was information that the Franciscans used to guide their construction of mission wine cellars. Although the information from Agricultura General was written specifically for Spanish vineyards and wineries, the friars used this viticultural knowledge to transform California's natural terrains. And what's interesting about this agricultural treatise is that the book recommended planting grapevines low to the ground in hedgerows because the author believed that untrained vines would blossom more readily. Although the book it did include instructions on how to train grapevines to grow along trellises or arbors, it discouraged growers from doing so, cautioning that trellises and wood might inhibit the flowering and growth of the vines. Thus, Indians pruned the vines using the head pruning method, which involved training the vines to grow into low bushes that did not need the support of wires, trellises, and posts. And you can see in this image, this is a 19th century photograph taken from Southern California. This is Sunny Slope Vineyard and Ranch, which was owned by Leonard J. Rose. He was a German immigrant to California. And, I've heard them described as growing almost like rose bushes, like a very untidy rose bush instead of a trellis grapevine. What is lucky for the Franciscans is that California's Mediterranean climate was very similar to that of Spain. And this meant that this practice of head pruning worked. So because it was so dry and not rainy, the weather here, the climate, enabled them to fend off moldy grapes and ruined crops that may have followed in a wetter climate. Now, the head pruning method lessened the labor that was initially required to plant vineyards, but the bending needed to prune and harvest the grapes was very strenuous. This scenario reflected farm labor across the missions. Clearing land, planting, sowing, hoeing, ditch digging, it all consisted of backbreaking stoop labor. And indeed, mission farm workers continued to harvest wheat using heavy sickles long after the labor-saving harvesting tools, such as the cradle, became common in other parts of North America. So they were just a little bit behind in California in terms of agricultural technology. Now, by the turn of the 19th century, mission vineyards were well established. In my research, one of the questions I pursued was how Native Californians produced the wine and whether they were able to enjoy the fruits of their labors. To answer these questions, I turned to the Mission Archive records in Santa Barbara, and I put these alongside and studied them alongside records and memory pieces from Californios and Euro-American migrants to California later in the 19th century. During this period, Euro-American historians and boosters depicted the harvest and crush in the idyllic and primitive terms commonly used to romanticize memories of the mission period. Bancroft was one such publisher who purported to share an objective history of California, but his work ultimately served as a vehicle of manifest destiny and white supremacy. Per contemporary scholars today, Bancroft racialized Californios as non-white and as relics of the past, members of an inferior and archaic society whose demise was inevitable. So Bancroft as a historical source is challenging. He does present some challenges. But despite these challenges, I was able to study his descriptions of winemaking alongside other archival sources to better understand the winemaking practices of the time, knowing, of course, that they must be understood through the lens of manifest destiny and filtered historical memory through which they were written. So here's how it happened. In mission wineries, native laborers took charge of preparing the grape harvest for fermentation under the supervision of a Franciscan viñero or a winemaker. In Bancroft's book, California Pastoral, he published the testimony of a Mexican Californio named Carlos N. Ijar. And in this testimony, we have this beautiful, rich description of the grape crush at Mission San Jose. Per Ehard's testimony, the Franciscan winemaker first selected a flat plot of ground, and on that ground, Indians would build a wooden platform and then cover it with clean cowhides. From there, they would pile it high with newly harvested grapes. Next, a group of, quote, well-washed Indians having on only a loincloth, the hair carefully tied up and the hand covered with cloth to wipe away the perspiration, each having a stick to steady himself, were put to treading out the grape juice, which was caught in leathern bags, unquote. This focus on Indians' cleanliness was particularly telling, and it emphasizes 19th century concerns with cleanliness and race. By instructing the mission Indians to crush the grape by foot, the Franciscans also drew on traditional Old World methods of winemaking. Bancroft went out of his way to reassure his Anglo-American audience that the Indians were clean, with a cloth to wipe away the perspiration, no less, and that no part of their hair, sweat, or skin, other than the feet, came in contact with the grape juices. In doing so, Bancroft's racialized image seemed to address prevailing 19th century stereotypes that characterize Indians as dirty or archaic. At the same time, this narrative conveyed a portrait of an antiquated pre-modern Spanish California, one in which semi-nude natives treaded out the grapes while the Franciscans watched. And indeed, later European, German, and Euro-American immigrants from the Eastern United States would point to these descriptions of Indians stomping out the grape harvest and point to their own work in using grape crushers, mechanizing the grape crush as a way to modernize the wine industry and make more hygienic wine. So that's something I talk about further in the book. After the crush, the fermentation process followed. And what the natives would do is they'd pour the juices into leather bags or into large wooden tubs covered with grape skins to ferment for 2 to 3 months. And the reason they used leather bags was simply scarcity. This was particularly true in the early decades of mission wine growing. Leather bags were more plentiful because wood was so scarce, and leather, because of the extensive cattle industry, leather was plentiful and cheap. And indeed, in their correspondence about the shipment of wine barrels, in their letters, Franciscan missionaries across Alta California communicated not only about the transport of wine, but also about returning empty barrels back to wine-producing missions so that they might be reused. Now, in addition to wine, most of the missions also distilled aguardiente from grapes and other fruits. And this is similar to modern day distilled spirits made from grape juice, like a brandy or a cognac, but less refined. Whatever grape must remained after they were done with the wine was juiced through a wooden press and distilled into homemade copper stills, and this would produce their aguardiente. In some cases, wines were also fortified with grape brandy as a treatment to help prevent spoilage. And this was valuable for transporting wine across long distances because fortified wine could be used for sacramental purposes so long as its alcohol content did not exceed 18%. So if you can imagine transporting heavy barrels of wine via horse and some sort of cart across California, say in the summertime, this was really useful for making it possible for that to happen. Now, beyond its use as a sacramental item or a simple agricultural food product, wine also carried broader political and social meaning. There were a lot of regulations surrounding wine and liquor, and these regulations were part of the Spanish provincial government's code of societal control. Broadly speaking, this code encompassed what historian James Sandos has described as the extensive colonial rules and regulations that the government implemented to impose rigid control across all social levels, from soldiers and colonists to missionaries and government officials, as well as the native Californians who were targets of colonization. Restrictions over who could purchase alcohol offered a way for the territorial government in Alta California to assert and maintain its tenuous control over the region's soldiers and indigenous populations. And, just to zoom out a little bit and provide some context, Alta California was, if you just think of the map of North America, it was incredibly far from Mexico City and the central government in Mexico. This was really the boonies, the remote northwestern frontier. So these strict laws were important to the Spanish government to really maintain a hold over the region. Under mission regulations, California natives found themselves strictly prohibited from freely enjoying wine, which was the literal fruit of their labor. The possession of equipment to make wine was also inherently political. That is, its access was restricted, giving undue privilege to the missions in monopolizing the alcohol trade in Alta California. Since the law made alcohol available only to Franciscans, colonists, and soldiers, legal access to wine on the open market became a way not only for the territorial government to denote racial status and privilege, but also for colonists and Indians alike to challenge these boundaries. Thus, wine growing and alcohol consumption emerged as a site of Indian resistance to the missionaries' authority, and also a place of engagement with the soldiers and colonists throughout the region. By seeking out wine and violating regulations, mission Indians were drawing on a long history of native rebellion and defiance of Spanish power. From the earliest days of Spanish colonization, we have evidence of mission Indians exercising daily acts of resistance against mission authorities. This took shape through everyday activities such as stealing food, feigning illness, refusing to work, or even running away. Other challenges to Spanish authority emerged through armed rebellions, things like the 1785 uprising at Mission San Gabriel or the 1825 Chumash Revolt. So Indians throughout Alta California overtly and covertly challenged Spanish imperial rule by making their own liquor, by stealing wine, and even by purchasing liquor from colonists and soldiers. Even though mission regulations ostensibly prohibited neophytes from procuring and enjoying alcohol, colonists in Los Angeles and other pueblos still sold wine to them, flagrantly disobeying the authority of mission priests. And in studying the mission records, I also noted other native challenges to alcohol restrictions. And one of the places I saw this was in the recorded responses sent by individual missions between 1813 and 1816 to an official imperial questionnaire sent by the government. And this questionnaire was specifically about the Indians of Alta California. In the questionnaire, there were inquiries about Indians' consumption of fermented drinks. So this was an area of concern for the government. At some missions, the friars assured the colonial government that the Indians consumed no fermented alcohol, presumably, of course, beyond taking wine at communion during the Mass. However, the Franciscans at Mission San Antonio admitted that the Indians had experienced, quote, the effects of the grape, unquote, and given the freedom to do so, they would not cease to enjoy it. At Santa Barbara, Fray Ramon Olves declared, quote, the Indians have no fermented drinks whatsoever of their own, but they hanker after ours, wherefore we keep them securely hid, unquote. At other missions, including San Carlos and San Gabriel, the Franciscans described the Indians' consumption of wine, which they enjoyed steadily and stealthily whenever they were able to procure it. Similarly, at San Juan Capistrano, there were responses like that as well, noting that if able to obtain alcohol, the Indians at their mission were highly susceptible to drunkenness. Now, what I'd like to do now is briefly transition to talk about the early commercial industry in Mexican California. And, Mexico achieved its independence from Spain after the War for Independence that lasted from 1810 through about 1820. And the shifting political and economic landscape in Alta California in the 1820s and 30s is what ultimately allowed the transition of wine growing from production, mostly for sacramental wine and local consumption to larger scale commercial production and distribution. And herein lay the origins of our wonderful commercial California wine industry. So we have Mexican independence in 1822, and about 10 years later, in 1833, the missions were secularized. This meant that control and oversight of the missions was transitioned from the church to lay landowners, to secular landowners. And this brought about changes in the law, and it redistributed land from the missions to, again, these secular landowners, creating ideal conditions for the expansion of wine and the commercialization of the industry. And there were a couple conditions that made this possible. First, the newly independent Mexican government liberalized trade laws. Spain had had very, very strict closed ports and borders, and made international trade illicit. But Mexico had a liberalized economy, and this legalized the international sale of many goods from California, including alcohol. Yes, they were taxed, they were regulated, but they could engage with traders from all over the world. Second, secularization redistributed lands with the intent of turning over the property to former Indians. This never really happened. Most of this land ended up in the hands of Californios and immigrants from Europe and the United States. Indeed, this is how our friend Mariano Vallejo, part of how he obtained such rich landholdings. Now, even though there was a shift from mission-based wine growing, viticulture remained a means of reinforcing racial hierarchies and asserting control over the region. During this period, alcohol continued to serve as a weapon for the racialized control and even the perpetual enslavement of Indigenous people. Indeed, under Mexican rule, social stratification deepened, even though the Mexican Constitution specifically granted citizenship to Indians in 1824. For example, just as it was in Spain, in Spanish California, I should say, selling liquor to Indians or providing them with alcohol was strictly prohibited under the law. Such laws regulating access to liquor continue to define racial and citizenship boundaries in the same vein as Spanish laws that had excluded natives from the parameters of civil society. As a consequence, for drinking alcohol, which employers often sold to Indians or gave to them in lieu of cash wages, Mexican Californios criminalized Indians and designated them as unfree laborers for the duration of their punishment. The payment of liquor in lieu of wages also prevented Indians from earning cash that they might save to purchase land or pursue entrepreneurial ventures that would allow them to own their own labor, own their own bodies, and achieve full economic independence. So this system simply replaced that of the Franciscan missionaries with a new, albeit less permanent, master, the Mexican Californio rancher. And wine was a key part of this systemic oppression. Now, this newly commercial wine industry expanded rapidly, and it reached new markets between the 1820s and the 1840s. But it still remained deeply entrenched in mission viticultural practices. Vineyardists almost universally planted mission grapes for their wines and used the same methods employed by Franciscan vintners. Wine growers continue to rely on native Californians as a source of inexpensive and often unfree labor. And this was allowed. For example, Article 16 of the 1834 Secularization Act stipulated as much, stating, quote, "The emancipated Indians will be obliged to assist at the indispensable common labor which, in the opinion of the governor, may be judged necessary for the cultivation of vineyards, orchards, and cornfields," unquote. Now, after the initiation of secularization, many natives did leave the missions, and they sought work on ranches and vineyards across Los Angeles. At this point, there were nearly 112 acres of vineyards in and around Los Angeles, so it was an attractive place for displaced Indians in need of employment. Between 1837 and 1842, these native laborers greatly expanded the amount of vineyards in the Los Angeles area, planting over 100,000 vines for wine growers. And this included El Aliso in the pueblo of Los Angeles. This was the home and property of a French immigrant to California. His name was Jean-Louis Vignes, but he was known more commonly as Don Luis by his Mexican Californio neighbors. He hired former mission Indians to complete all the labor on his property, digging irrigation canals from the nearby river to his vineyard, plowing the vineyards, hauling and planting vines, and harvesting and crushing the grapes. As I stated earlier, Mexican society continued to exclude natives from full participation as citizens. And a major part of this exclusion was defined by the continued prohibition of selling alcohol to them, as they were the only group barred from freely enjoying California's newly liberalized markets. The numerous laws regulating access to alcohol and the cultural taboos restricting Indians' consumption of wine made the industry an important tool in helping to reassert the class and racial privileges of elite Californios that had first been established under the Spanish laws. And what is really telling is how Californios weaponized Indians' violations of liquor laws to enforce punishments that truly consigned them as a permanent underclass of unfree laborers, both for city governments and for ranchers. And one example of this is an 1837 case involving Don Juan Bandini. He was a government-appointed administrator to the mission at San Gabriel following secularization. And this case offers an example of the relationship between liquor and control of native peoples. Bandini had been born in Peru to Spanish parents, and he arrived in California in the 1820s as a young man. He was involved in politics from the late 1820s onward, serving in various positions from a member of the Territorial Assembly to a customs inspector and later as an administrator of the secularized mission. In his position, Bandini also received multiple land grants that included former mission lands at San Gabriel and San Juan Capistrano. During his administration of Mission San Gabriel, Bandini became involved in a scandal. Critics allege that Bandini had taken to selling brandy to the former mission Indians at San Gabriel and then punishing them for drunkenness. As an official charged with overseeing secularization, Bandini was officially responsible for protecting the well-being of these former mission Indians. Given his position, he undoubtedly would have been aware of the liquor laws, but Bandini dispensed alcohol and punished people for drinking the beverages he himself provided. In doing so, Bandini abused his power to make a profit while also using Indians' fondness for alcohol as a means of discipline and control. Now, we unfortunately don't know the outcome of the case. It wasn't clear in the historical record, and I tried really hard to find it. But it's not likely that Bandini was punished by officials, and he certainly remained in his post for several years after this case. Still, it offers an example as to how Californios used alcohol to control the native populations. And in fact, Bandini may have even needed laborers for his own vast land holdings, and he was not alone in providing Indians with liquor. Like Bandini, other vineyardists and landowners used wine as currency to pay their workers, to control them, and to limit their freedom. And as noted, government officials and vineyard owners then used Indians' violation of liquor laws against them to exert punishment and control. So in Mexican California, wine became even more significant as a way to control Indians and oppress them as a permanently unfree class of workers. And, this was a practice that continued in American California, in Los Angeles, whereby intoxicated Native peoples would, well, first they would be paid with alcohol by American and European immigrant landowners. They would, drink their wages in downtown Los Angeles, in the Pueblo on Saturday night, and be arrested on Sunday and be hired out by the city on Monday morning. Now, I think I'll go ahead and just wrap up since we're coming close to the hour. But if we consider the 19th century roots of the California wine industry, in the Grapes of Conquest, I demonstrate how California wine is not and never has been simply about the production of an agricultural commodity. The picturesque vineyards and the fragrant wines that we associate with the California wine industry truly mask the nuances of its complex history. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this back on, and I would just love to hear your comments.
Yes, I'm unmuting. Anyone who wants to ask a question, please unmute yourself to ask Julia questions. Oh, sorry. No questions?
Yeah. Patricia, we're going to see the top of your head.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry.
You have a nice home.
Hi, I'm Jim Danaher. There was at one time a grapevine found on the Channel Islands that might have been an original Mission Vineyard grape. Do you know of anything that might comment or have any comments on that, if any?
I know a little bit about that. I have down here in the Channel Islands, I have several colleagues in anthropology who have studied, the amazing natural history that is there. I do know that there was a vineyard planted there I believe in the 19th century. I don't know if I don't believe it was a mission. It was part of the mission. The closest mission would have been Mission San Buenaventura. I believe it was planted by ranchers, but it's not something that I'm intimately familiar with. But it is a 19th century vineyard.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, but first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It is a side of history I haven't heard about, and it's very, very exciting. But I am wondering if you found any evidence about Vallejo doing the same kind of thing that Bandini did about selling alcohol to the natives and then penalizing them.
I did not find evidence of Vallejo doing the similar kind of behavior. I will say most of my book and most of my research is more on Southern California, and I don't get into as much detail about the northern vineyards, simply because they were established a little bit later in the 1870s and 1880s, and that may be coming in my next project. I'm excited to look a little closer to what is home for me. I wouldn't be surprised, though. Honestly, Mariano Vallejo was the administrator, just like Bandini, of Mission Sonoma, of the mission up there. So I wouldn't be surprised, but I didn't find evidence. No.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. By the 1870s and 80s, he was past his peak, but perhaps when he was secularizing, he might have done that. So thank you very much.
In this area, I know mission grapes were often planted around a central stake. A vine would grow around a stake, and these were described very soon after secularization by some of the early settlers here.
Yeah,
Is
he's the guy
that,
who wrote about
Sarah
Viviana.
dentist?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just wondering if there was something, you talked about grapevines growing in hedgerows, but
Mhm.
I'm wondering if they were often around a stake.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Peter. In the books and the sources I read, that almost feels to me like an intermediary step between, the head pruning, the hedgerows, and fully trellised vineyards. I mean, I could be wrong, but it sounds like an intermediary, like an in-between method. I didn't come across that. And in the sources I read in Southern California, what I saw was a lot of the head pruned hedgerow grapes, and then newer immigrants from the eastern states and Europe coming in and trellising their grapes. So it was like one or the other, but not this in between. And I find that really interesting. I made a note of that because I'd like to explore that further.
Yes, they're described by William Boggs, for instance, who came here very early. And of course, the mission vines here were planted in the 1820s, so it's towards the end of the mission period.
Mhm. Oh, thank you for sharing. That's fascinating.
May I make a comment? When I was younger, they were a head prune was on stakes. The trellising, and I'm not sure in Southern California if they use some sort of trellising that they really did not do here until they had probably the 1970s.
Wow. That is really fascinating. So I'm leaving your group with many questions. I love this.
Also the Peter, the Muybridge, those were the kind of hedgerows. They were on the grapes were on the ground.
Well, yes, under
Buena Vista?
Herasti,
Yeah.
he made a big deal of how he could economize viticulture by just growing everything on the ground. But that's not the impression I had of the mission vineyards from other sources.
Right. Yeah. I was just commenting that
Yeah.
that's what he did.
Yes.
The Vitis
The,
compactus go up the tree. Nobody got ahead.
I was just going to say that I think the head pruned vineyards are like little poplar trees, and they're not as much a sprawl as some of the other methods of just letting vines kind of sprawl on the ground. They were mostly off the ground.
Like rose bushes is how I've heard them described.
Yeah.
Like a low rose bush that would get kind of tangled, and it's hard to find with the earlier stuff. It's hard to get photographs, right? There's no photography in 1805. So it's a source issue. I wish I get descriptions of it, but I wondered, is the Mission Vineyard in 1799 at San Gabriel, what did it look like relative to, say, the Mission Vineyard up at Sonoma in the 1830s, relative to expanded Mission Vineyards in the 1850s and 60s. I can rely on written descriptions, but the images, I so wish we had them.
Paintings is the best.
While we have a lull in the conversation, I'm gonna pop a link in the chat. that is a link to where the book is available. And if it's not, purchasing is not an interest, or, who needs more clutter, right? It might be at your local library. So just popping the title and information there. I just love using the library.
I'd like to make a comment. This is David Viviani. Peter, isn't there a Sonoma Indian that actually owned land and grew grapes?
Yeah.
Yes, that's another interesting story. According to Harassi, who came here in 1857, there was an area of what he said were 30-year-old grapevines that were very productive. And he said these had been planted by a Native American around, and he dated that area to 1832 as far as when they were planted. And sure enough, there is a record of a grant, a small grant of about 100 acres called the LAC grant, LAC, that was in fact granted to a Native American by the name of Viviano. It was subsequently granted to one of Vallejo's artillerymen, Rodriguez. But I think that provides evidence that there was, in fact, a privately owned vineyard here, because this same Native American, we have records of him purchasing materials at a local, at the first store here in 1840. So he clearly lived here for several years, and most likely he obtained these acres from the mission. I think there are other areas too around Santa Clara where there's small grants of land that originated from the missions there and were granted to Native Americans.
That's
So-
absolutely correct, Bo. Yeah. I'm sorry I cut you off. Were you going to say
So I
something?
think this is an example of something similar in this area.
Mhm.
Now, when Vallejo came, he totally ignored any grants from the missions, and he felt no compunction in giving the land to other people. And I think similar things happened elsewhere.
And Peter, have you ever discovered how that piece of land got to be the centerpiece of Valle, not of Harasti's
Well,
Vista?
when Harassi came to Sonoma, those, he said, were by far the most productive vines on his property. In
Yeah.
fact, they were almost the only vines there. So within a year, he was already making wine and producing award-winning wines. The only other grapevines on the property were some that had been planted 2 or 3 years before by the previous owner, who was called Julius Rose. So there were these very young grapevines, and then there were these 30-year-old grapevines. And this area was never considered to be part of the mission vineyards.
No.
There definitely were mission vineyards here, but not in this area, which is about 3 miles from the plaza.
Peter, I have a question. How did he get the name Viviano?
Well,
You know,
it's clearly a baptized name. Unfortunately, for the mission here, there are no records of adults who are baptized. In the baptismal book, which is at Berkeley, you can see that these pages have been torn out. So we have children's names of children who were baptized. We have marriages, we have burials, but nothing for adult baptisms. But most likely he was baptized here in Sonoma. However, we just don't know anything. We really know practically nothing about him.
That's a shame.
But it's great that there was a Native American who made wine in Sonoma for what, 15, 20 years?
Well, for many years,
Yeah.
I consider him, the first commercial grape grower in this county, certainly. And the next owner of this property, Damaso Rodriguez, continued to sell grapes from his property, as did Jacob Lease, who bought the property in 1849. So clearly there were grapes growing here that were quite productive even before Harassi came in 1857.
And do you think it's significant that the property passed to Jacob Lease, who is Mariano's close partner in a lot of things?
Well, he was quite an entrepreneur.
I dropped a few links in the chat. They're essentially the same database, but the first one is from the Huntington Library. It's the Early California Population Project. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And I just found out that it looks like they moved the database to UC Riverside. So this is a really cool source for those of you who are not familiar with it on understanding early Native Californians, and it has records from all of the missions, and they've been digitized. I haven't played around with this in a while. I can only imagine it's gotten better, you know, with changes in technology. So just something if it's of use to anyone.
That's
Good knowledge.
So if anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
Julia, you said at the beginning that the narrative of California wine history kind of goes from Harassi, followed or the industrialization, to the Italians, followed by the CWA. And who's responsible for that reductive kind of history?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Bo. I think that part of the reason is there's just not been as much written by historians about the wine industry. It's actually shocking. Agriculture is so important to our state history, and you look at a crop like citrus or wheat, or you look at 20th century farm workers. There's such a rich literature, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that historians just haven't really, there's been a few that have in recent years, but it's just not, it doesn't have that long, beautiful, rich literature. I think the other part of it, and this, you know, this may be controversial a little bit, I think it has to do a little bit with the tourism aspect of wine. You know, people are not traveling from all over the world to tourist orange orchards, right? I live in Ojai, and we just finished our pixie season, and we have tourists, but there's no pixie tasting down in the orchards. It's not the same as it is with wine, right? And I do think that the wine industry is part of you know, in the 20th century has really romanticized and perpetuated some of these mythologies. It's not fun to tell a story of conquest, right? And of native peoples who were absolutely eviscerated, right? That's not something that most tourists and wine consumers want to read as they're, you know, walking up the hill to go wine tasting.
Yeah.
I tell a story myself in the epilogue of the book from about 4 years ago. I was on vacation in Sonoma with my husband at Buena Vista, and we were, I'm sure you guys have been there, right? You walk up the hill and there's the walk through history.
Yeah.
And it's a very romantic portrayal. And the historian in me says, well, that's not the full story. But then I'm also a wine tourist, and I understand that there are people that does not align neatly with the story we tell around the beauty and romance of California wineries and the tourist part of it. So I could go on. I think there's lots of reasons, but those are the two big ones I would say.
And I would add that the Wine Institute, which used to be a lot more
Mhm.
proactive in promoting the history and promoting California wine from the mid 1930s to when it became strictly a more a advocacy and lobbying arm. They can, that and the University of California and Gallo
Mhm.
kind of controlled the narrative of, and you can't forget Robert Mondavi, who you know is the ultimate Italian kind of entrepreneur figure. And
Absolutely, Bo. I think you're absolutely right. And those groups coming together, I think, to really celebrate the role of Italian Americans in particular in building the wine industry. And was this group important? Absolutely, in building the 20th century, especially the post-World War II wine industry. But I think that I'm reading a book right now, I'm actually reviewing it, that, calls these post-World War II winemakers pioneers. And I quibble with that word a little bit. They were absolutely, their labor was important in bringing California wine to the global scale and building the industry we know today, but they didn't build it from scratch.
no,
So
but they
many
built it from
groups.
kind of ruined choirs.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Mhm. So I like to celebrate the different groups who were on the ground in the 19th century, groups that many of us don't associate with wine, the Chinese, California natives, Germans.
Absolutely.
They're so important to building the 19th century wine industry, and I find it all fascinating.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Chinese, here in Sonoma, there were a few wineries where the chief winemaker wasn't actually a Chinese person. There was Nicholas Cady and Agua Caliente. Julius Dressel had a Chinese winemaker.
Mm.
And then during the phylloxera epidemic, many wine owners, vineyard owners, credited the Chinese with basically saving the whole wine industry by field grafting of grapes, grapevines. So, for instance, in Glen Ellen, there was a winemaker, Leopold Justy, who said that it's due to the Chinese that the wine industry was saved from destruction by these very considerable efforts at grafting that went on. So the Chinese played a big role here in Sonoma.
And we have I'll share a digital copy. A gentleman, William Heinz, who was a wine historian. A lot of his material is at the Wine Library in St. Helena. And his thesis in 1978 was on the Chinese in the wine industry.
I'd like to add too, for my little bit of marketing, where we talk about building on others' successes. As we were coming out of Prohibition, they needed a way to make wine more popular. And the Fromm family went to Christian Brothers and asked if they could put their name, Christian Brothers, on their wine. And it seemed to make it more legitimate and religious. I'll mute myself now.
I didn't talk about this in my formal lecture, but the genesis of this project came out of my doctoral dissertation. And that grew out of my first seminar paper in graduate school. And, some scholars will tell you the origins of their work, and it's something highbrow and, a serendipitous find in the archives at the Bancroft Library or the archives at Stanford University. And mine is not so such a neat story, but it's a fun story. I was a young graduate student and I needed a topic for my seminar paper, and I was home for the holidays and I didn't have a topic. And I was with my parents sharing a bottle of wine at their kitchen table in Fairfield. And my mother had had a glass, maybe two. It doesn't take much for her to, get joyful. And she said, the Chinese built all of the wine tunnels up in Napa and Sonoma. Why don't you write about that? And like many of you, I've visited so many wineries over the years. If we have family visiting, what do? You take them to the winery. So from childhood onward, I had toured. I have memories of, plugging my little nose in Sebastiani because I didn't like the smell. And despite all of those visits, I had never, ever heard that the Chinese were responsible for building the wine cellars. And I was hooked. So that's where this project grew out of, sharing a bottle of wine with family and reminiscing about visits to the wineries over the years. So not a serendipitous archival find, but a fun story.
What about your grandparents who were braceros?
Yeah. So my great-grandfathers, great uncles, and both of my grandfathers were braceros in the 40s through the early 60s. They worked up and down the state of California. And when my family moved to Fairfield, when my parents moved there in the 1980s, and my great uncles came to visit, they said, well, gosh, we've been here before. We were here in the 50s picking pears. So I grew up hearing the stories of their work as braceros, the challenges, the hard living conditions. I grew up hearing my grandmother talk about, wondering if her father would come home, if her brothers were going to be safe coming home. And that really motivated my research. I wanted to do work on agricultural laborers. I thought I was going to do a 20th century project, but then I started learning about Chinese wine workers, and well, I went backwards, went backwards in time.